Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to dive right into the dense, incredibly chaotic, and absolutely fascinating thousand-year history of Rome. We'll be tracking its step-by-step rise and, its inevitable fall. We're going to map out this massive timeline chronologically so you can see exactly how one of history's most complex stories unfolded.
So let's kick things off with a pretty massive question. How exactly did a muddy homeless camp become the greatest empire in history? Because Rome definitely didn't start with marble palaces or those massive legions we always picture. Nope, it started in the mud. And to understand how it grew into an absolute juggernaut, we really have to go back to its highly dramatic origins.
We're starting way back in 771 BC with a literal myth. It involves a jealous uncle, a divine pregnancy, and an animal rescue that sounds, honestly, straight out of a comic book. Basically, a king gets overthrown by his brother, Amulius, who then tries to permanently get rid of his rival's newborn twin grandsons, Romulus and Remus, by tossing them into a river. But, wild plot twist, they wash ashore, are famously nursed by a female wolf, and eventually grow up to overthrow that exact same wicked uncle.
But when it was finally time to build their own city, Romulus and Remus just couldn't agree on which hill to use. This led to this super petty sibling rivalry where Romulus starts building a tiny wall on his preferred hill, and Remus, being a total classic older brother, jumps over it just to mock him, essentially daring Romulus to do something about it.
Well, he did. And this perfectly illustrates the incredibly ruthless foundation of Rome. Romulus essentially murdered his brother right then and there. Why? Because there were literally no laws yet. He built his city right on his brother's corpse, named it Rome after himself, and crowned himself its very first king. Talk about a dramatic start, right? So, now as king, Romulus had a city, but there was a slight issue. Nobody lived there. To fix this, he declared Rome an asylum city, and man did it quickly fill up with absolute chaos. Runaway slaves, exiles, debt dodgers, criminals. Pretty much anyone on the run from something came pouring in. So suddenly, you have this highly ambitious city with tall walls and a severely chaotic population made up entirely of men.
Which, as you might guess, presented a rather massive problem. There were 0 women in the city. To solve this gender imbalance, Rome invited their Sabine neighbors over for a giant housewarming festival. And, right in the middle of the party, the Romans just abducted their future wives. This wild event actually sparked Rome's very first war, which only ended when the Sabine women themselves physically stepped between the two armies and demanded they just merge into one society.
Let's speed run down the timeline for a second. The Romans eventually get completely sick of tyrannical kings and create a republic in 509 BC. But the real turning point? That hits in 390 BC. The Gauls invade, burn Rome to the ground, and totally humiliate them. And this catastrophic event acts as Rome's official origin story for their militaristic villain arc. They basically vow right then and there to never be humiliated again. To make absolutely sure they're never invaded again, the Republic gets heavily addicted to expansion. They go hyper-militaristic, eventually completely wiping out their massive rival Carthage in the Punic Wars, like literally erasing the city from the map. From there, they conquer Spain, North Africa, Greece, and Gaul, fundamentally reshaping the demographics of the entire ancient world step by step.
Now, what's really fascinating here is Julius Caesar. Think of him as the final boss of the Republic. You always hear about his ruthless conquest of Gaul, but he was actually beloved by regular Roman citizens. Look at his practical reforms. He created the 365-day calendar we still use today, lowered taxes, gave land to war veterans, and heavily regulated the grain supply so the poor wouldn't starve. The common people absolutely loved the guy.
But on the flip side, he started absorbing every political office like he was collecting trading cards. Dictator? Yup. Consul? Sure. Head priest? Why not? The Senate, who had spent the last 500 years being deeply, deeply paranoid about kings, grew completely terrified that Caesar was basically getting ready to crown himself.
So the politicians actually thought they were saving the Republic by stabbing him 23 times in the middle of a Senate meeting. But instead, they triggered a massive civil war. Why? Well, because the public actually liked Caesar. They were absolutely furious that the elite politicians just murdered the guy who was giving them free grain.
Enter Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, who eventually becomes Augustus, the very first true emperor. He steps in and realizes that civil wars happen because soldiers are loyal to rich generals who pay them rather than to Rome itself. So he brilliantly restructures the entire military.
He makes it a professional standing force with 20-year terms, entirely reliant on the state for salaries and retirement land. This one genius move removes the main fuel for civil wars. This massive stabilization ushers in a true golden age, creating a really stark contrast. Inside the empire, you have an administration that absorbs shocks, paved roads, aqueducts, written laws, and state grain. But outside, in the barbarian territories, it's highly decentralized. Sure, it's more flexible with lower taxes, but if something goes wrong out there, you have literally zero large-scale protection.
However, those borders definitely weren't completely safe. In 9 AD, Rome suffers a truly horrific shock. A trusted Germanic ally named Arminius uses his deep knowledge of Roman tactics right against them. He leads Roman general Varus and 3 entire legions into a dense, muddy forest where their famous formations are totally useless. 20,000 professional soldiers are slaughtered, which permanently forces Rome to abandon expanding into Germany forever.
Meanwhile, back in Rome, the political machinery is really starting to decay. Power starts slipping away from the Senate and even the emperor, and falls right into the hands of the elite Praetorian Guard. Originally, these guys were just created to be the emperor's bodyguards, but these heavily armed, permanently stationed soldiers quickly figure out that they can simply assassinate emperors they don't like and just install the ones they do.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that by the year 69 AD, famously known as the year of the 4 emperors, the illusion was totally shattered. 4 different men violently claimed the throne in a single year, simply because different armies backed them. It became painfully obvious to everyone. Whoever controlled the army controlled Rome. Tradition and law didn't really matter anymore.
And this military dominance plunges Rome straight into the 3rd century crisis. For 100 years, it's just pure chaos. Emperors are being assassinated practically weekly, the empire is hit with terrifying citywide plagues, economic hyperinflation destroys the economy, and they face simultaneous invasions from Germanic tribes in the west and the Persians in the east. The empire very nearly tears itself completely apart. To survive this nightmare, Emperor Constantine realizes the empire is simply way too big and unstable to rule the old way, so he shifts the real power over to the east, building Constantinople. The east becomes rich, highly defensible, and Christian. Meanwhile, the west, which includes the original city of Rome itself, is essentially left behind to become this decaying Latin-speaking ghost province.
The beginning of the end for the West actually starts quite neutrally on paper, but ends in total catastrophe. Tens of thousands of Goths, who are fleeing the terrifying expansion of the Huns, arrive at the Roman border on the Danube seeking asylum. Rome agrees to let them in, but deeply corrupt Roman officials brutally exploit and starve these migrants, setting the stage for an inevitable disaster.
Let's trace exactly how this played out step by step. Pushed west by the Huns, the Goths seek safety. But that severe mistreatment by corrupt Roman officials pushes the starving migrants to completely revolt. And they don't just defeat a Roman army, they actually kill the emperor on the battlefield. This shatters the psychological border of the empire forever, proving Rome could no longer integrate or even control newcomers.
Because the Western Roman military is now, frankly, laughably weak, their desperate new strategy just becomes appeasement. Rome starts making deals with armed groups they can't defeat militarily anymore, offering a very simple trade. Hey, here's some land, please just stop burning us.
But, you can't really satisfy that kind of leverage, which triggers a total death spiral. The Vandals sweep in and capture North Africa. And without North Africa's grain and tax revenue, Rome literally cannot afford to pay its soldiers. This directly leads to the Visigoths marching right in and repeatedly sacking the capital city of Rome itself.
And that finally brings us to 476 AD. Spoiler alert, there is no epic, cinematic final battle. A Germanic commander simply walks right up to the ironically named last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and politely asks him to quit. He steps down, and just like that, the Western Roman Empire quietly vanishes.
We really hope this explainer sheds some light on the mechanics of history's greatest rise and fall. As you saw, it wasn't just one big event, but a slow, step-by-step cascade of internal shifts and border crises. And it definitely leaves us with a pretty provocative final question. If an unstoppable 1,000-year empire can vanish so quietly due to border collapse and internal fatigue, could the empires of our modern world